Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the Department of Energy's deep dive webinar on our Pathways to Commercial Liftoff report on virtual power plants. I'm Vanessa Chan, the Chief Commercialization Officer and Director of the Office of Technology Transitions. And today we're going to dive into the insights from DOE's Liftoff reports on VPPs that was released September of last year and highlight some of the exciting new VPP developments within and outside of DOE since that time. But before we dive into the heart of our discussion, let me frame the purpose of today's webinar and the overarching Liftoff initiative. The Liftoff reports are the product of ongoing effort across the Department of Energy to enhance collaboration between public and private sectors, aiming to expedite the commercialization and broader deployment of essential clean energy technologies. As we say here at DOE, the clean energy transition is private sector led and government enabled, which means are aiming to unlock a part of the global 23 trillion market in clean energy transitions by 2030. This ambitious endeavor involves mobilizing private capital investment across a diverse spectrum of over 20 plus clean energy technologies and sectors, pivotal for achieving commercial liftoff and ensuring a sustainable, resilient energy future. To ensure initiatives remain closely aligned with the dynamic challenges and opportunities capital allocators encounter within each sector, the Liftoff reports are designed to be living, breathing documents. They're going to be periodically refreshed to reflect new insights from industry experts and shifts in the commercialization landscapes. So those of you who've been living under a rock and haven't heard about the Liftoff reports, you can find them at liftoff.energy.gov. That's liftoff.energy.gov, where you can also find recordings of our past webinars. So it's my honor today to introduce two of my favorite people here at DOE, my colleagues for our virtual fireside chat, Jigar Shah, the Director of the Loan Programs Office, and Jeff Marushin, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Senior Advisor to the Secretary. Thank you both for being here, and let's dive right into the world of virtual power plants. So Jeff, I'd love to start with you. At DOE, we define VPPs broadly. They're aggregations of distributed energy resources, or DERs, that can balance electricity demand and supply and provide utility-scale, utility-grade grid services. This one definition encompasses many, many different types of resources. Can you help us understand some of the different types of VPPs and the different services they provide to the grid?
Absolutely, Vanessa. And you and Jigar are two of my favorite colleagues here as well. And I'm so honored to be able to be a part of this conversation with you both. The common denominator across all VPPs is that they aggregate and orchestrate small scale assets located on the distribution grid, such as rooftop solar, with behind the meter batteries, electric vehicles and chargers, electric water heaters, and smart buildings and their controls. And so one easy way to categorize VPP is by the type of DERs, aggregations. So smart thermostat, water heat, commercial and industrial flexible loads have been enrolled in demand response programs for decades, as we know. So collectively, we might refer to this category as demand flexibility, and it can be used either to shed or shift demand. Storage VPPs or solar plus storage VPPs have the ability to actually export power back to the building or even back to the grid to reduce demand on bulk system assets. EV charging infrastructure plays a key role in managed charging VPPs, which shifts charging load over time. And if the chargers are bidirectional, you may also export power to a building or to the grid with what we refer to as vehicle to X technology, which is a topic we are talking about quite a bit these days. Many VPPs also include all of the above. And so there are many different ways to think about them independently, but also collectively, as I just described. And this type of segmentation allows us to concentrate on the problem areas that VPPs aim to solve and begin to assess the value each VPP can bring to the grid in terms of enhancing reliability, flexibility, and efficiency. And what's most exciting and what I want to underscore here is that so many of these technologies are already proven today, and the innovation area and what's really exciting that we're working on collectively here at DOE is how they're combined and managed by utilities, by third-party aggregators, and by regional grid operators. So again, the biggest innovation is really how they're combined and managed right now.
That is super cool, Jeff. And the thing I really like about it is the fact that these are like consumer, things that people can actually help with. Like you talked about water heaters and EV charging. And so all of us here at home actually can play a role, which is exciting. I want to switch over to Jigger and really understand from you the potential impact of successfully integrating VPPs into our energy system. Can you share your thoughts on why this is important and what benefits we could see?
Thanks, Vanessa. Peak demand on the grid is growing, and this peak demand is really the part of the transition that is the most expensive. Utilities have been predicting load growth for years, but this is one of the first times that the National Electricity Reliability 2023 long-term reliability assessment forecast shows that peak years. Utilities like Georgia Power, Arizona Public Service, Duke Energy, and more have revised their peak load forecasts upwards. So to meet this load growth, we really need three things. We need to install more clean, firm power generation like nuclear, geothermal, and hydro. We need to expand our grid capacity, including grid enhancing technologies, reconductoring, and other technologies to get more out of the grid that we've already paid for. And as we are talking about here, we need to increase demand flexibility in the form of virtual power plants. Virtual power plants are the fastest of those three strategies to deploy, and so they really buy us time to build out the other two. VPPs enhance grid efficiency by reducing peaks and are really cheaper than alternatives, critical at a time of increasing energy burden where almost 1 in 6 American households are behind on their energy bills. And you might ask why they're cheaper. It's really because, as you suggested with the appliances, they harness assets that we're already paying for, that are already on the grid, or will be added to the grid here over the next 6 years. The Liftoff report shows the enormous amount of new EV chargers, water, programmable thermostats, and other DER capacity that we're adding to the grid each and every year. Almost all of these new devices now come with an app or virtual power plant. Many utilities are thinking about giving people a 20% discount if they enroll into these sort of auto-enrolled virtual power plant type frameworks. And if we can get 20% of our entire peak demand to be flexible by 2030 across the country, and many utilities like Portland General and others have those as stated goals, that would save ratepayers $10 billion per year. So overall, VPPs represent a paradigm shift from only being able to flex supply, which is how we currently run our grid, to also being able to flex demand. And the increased urgency due to revised peak demand forecasts calls for accelerated deployment of VPPs. This is not merely about managing demand more efficiently, but fundamentally transforming how we think about and operate our energy systems. Inaction is just going to be really expensive.
No, that's great. And I don't know about all of you, but I remember when I was growing up, there was no such thing as an app. And when you want to change the television channel, the remote control is the youngest kid in the family room. So it's kind of cool right now that we have all this technology, which actually allows us to help save money and to work with the grid. So I think I totally agree with you. Inaction is expensive, and it's now here that we can really help with this. And so, Jeff, I wanted to talk a little bit about a lot of the work underway, both within our team at the Department of Energy and our external partners to actually accelerate VPP deployment. So can you give us a rundown of some of the key collaborations and projects at DOE that are helping to scale up and integrate VPPs into the broader energy system?
Absolutely. I think it is DOE is and our partners are really at the forefront right now of fostering an ecosystem. And that ecosystem not only supports, but accelerates the adoption of integration of VPPs into our overall energy system. So we like to think about it here as really that we're taking a wraparound approach to reach stakeholders all across that ecosystem. We've talked about the Liftoff report. Chapter 4 of that report lists over 20 different DOE programs related to VPPs. And in that short window of time since the Liftoff report came out in September, there has already been an explosion of new activity. I'll talk about a few of those things, but just know that there's much more that's underway. Within the Office of Electricity, for example, the Distribution Grid Transformation Program is spearheading efforts to introduce new standards based on industry input, and they're publishing working papers on topics like grid service definitions and an aggregator code of conduct in an effort to mature the market faster than would otherwise happen on its own. To reach regulators and state policymakers, my office, the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, created a $4 million technical assistance opportunity aimed at utility regulators and state policymakers. Our website just went live last week, and we've been supporting VPP workshops such as at NARUC just last month. DOE's Vehicle Grid Integration, VGI initiative, is developing plans to disseminate best practices in areas like grid data sharing and transparency. And we're also looking to build guidance for more robust cost-benefit analyses frameworks for grid investments to ensure that VPPs are never overlooked because of outdated accounting methods. Our Office of Policy is also in the midst of scoping out novel analysis that will use granular grid models to forecast the economic value of demand flexibility as a means of managing down energy costs for all consumers, whether they're enrolled in a VPP or not. And of course, thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, there is a substantial amount of financial support. One of the exciting things that our department has announced, the Grid Resilience and Innovation Program, or GRIP, as many folks know, has an upcoming funding round with billions of dollars in potential support for VPP infrastructure like DER management systems. The Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, OSED, has been actively reviewing grant applications for distributed energy system demonstrations that are capable of serving more than 25% of peak demand with DERs. And I'll let Jigger speak to what he's seeing in the application pipeline at the Loan Programs Office, where DOE is providing low-cost financing for large-scale VPP projects. But before he does, I want to mention, as we've talked about, the momentum for VPPs isn't confined just to DOE. External organizations are playing pivotal roles in facilitating a broader understanding and adoption of VPPs across the energy sector. For instance, the collaboration between NARUC and NASIO on developing a curriculum for DER compensation and integration is a game changer. Similarly, RMI's Virtual Power Plant Partnership, or VP3, has made significant contributions in developing utility VPP cases, analyzing the greenhouse gas emissions reduction benefits of VPPs, publishing policy principles, and more. And we've seen guidance from groups like GridWise Alliance and the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association on the nuts and bolts of how to implement VPPs. So this topic is vast. The breadth of organizations and programs working on accelerating adoption reflects that.
You know, this is amazing. And I know we threw out a lot of acronyms, a lot of different programs there, but this is a recorded webinar. So this will be posted so you guys can go back and rewind Jeff and listen to all the work that's being done here because there's so much going on that you didn't even cover all of it. But it's great to hear we're much part of a much bigger ecosystem that's tackling this challenge. And for those of you who don't remember Liftoff Report, that's on liftoff.energy.gov. I'm going to keep plugging it throughout the webinar. And Jigger, on the heels of the Liftoff Report, there's been a lot of movement in the VPP market. What are you seeing across the U.S. landscape of VPP, broadly speaking? And what can you tell us about the project pipeline at the Loan Programs Office that might give us hints as to what's to come?
Well, it's really exciting to see, Vanessa. And as you suggested, we're private sector led, government enabled. So we're really monitoring a lot of this activity. In the overall US VPP market, the recent increase in M&A activity is a clear indicator of the industry's recognition of the substantial value VPPs offer and that their time really has come. For a few examples, Google just spun out Nest, which merged with OhmConnect to form Renew Home, a powerful combination of consumer-facing smart home technology with advanced VPP capabilities. Schneider sold most of their stake in AutoGrid to Uplight, in what seems to be a strategic alignment of advanced analytics and AI-driven energy management solutions. Swell acquired Renew, a solar plus storage installer, to enhance its coverage in the southeastern United States, and as a testament to the growing demand for integrated energy solutions outside of the first mover states like New York, California, and Texas. Beyond M&A, there's been a huge wave of corporate collaborations. Sunrun with Ford, Energy Hub and Weave Grid with Toyota, countless partnerships between DER aggregators and OEMs. Sunrun and Sonova even called themselves VPP companies in a recent earnings call. These strategic moves within the industry indicate a growing consensus on the value proposition of VPPs. They're not just about optimizing energy resources, they're about reshaping the energy landscape to be more distributed, consumer-centric, and sustainable. In the LPO pipeline, we're seeing all kinds of VPPs from a mix of developers, aggregators, platforms, and utilities. Our first VPP deal that we announced was a loan guarantee to Sonova for up to $3 billion to deploy solar plus storage with VPP software, which has already been deployed in Puerto Rico. Thanks to LPO's low-cost debt, the first securitization was over 20% in LMI communities with a focus on Puerto Rico. In our 1706 Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Pipeline, we're seeing utilities integrating VPP projects with bulk system projects to enhance the value of upgraded transmission lines or new clean generation. What does that tell us about what's to come? Today, most of the registered devices are with high information households. Our partners are ensuring more equitable DER deployment when we can make DERs more affordable through low-cost financing instead of credit cards and VPP participation incentives. More auto enrollment in VPPs, it's always easy to opt out, but the participant experience is getting more and more seamless. And also industry acceptance. Utilities are embracing VPPs, so it's not just about third-party aggregators bidding into wholesale markets. VPPs are becoming the new way we run our distribution systems in some parts of the country, especially rural electric co-ops. Jen will provide many examples in her deep dive today.
So Jigger and Jeff, it's like so amazing listening to all the stuff that's going on. It's just completely exciting and inspiring. So thank you for sharing the latest of what you've seen since we published these Liftoff reports at liftoff.energy.gov. And as we transition to the next segment of our webinar, I really am thrilled to introduce the big brains behind all of this is Jen Downing, who's going to share the insights from the VPP Liftoff report, where we've gathered from over 80 interviews with industry stakeholders and dozens of DOE experts. Her presentation promises to spark further dialogue on how we scale up VPPs, a resilient and sustainable energy future. But as you know, Jigger said, inaction is expensive, so we have to move now, and Jen is going to show you how to do it. So Jen, take it away.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. And thank you, Jeff and Jigger. Let's dive in. As Jigger mentioned, for the first time in over a decade, peak demand on the grid is growing. And between now and 2030, we are expecting roughly 60 gigawatts of peak demand to be added to the grid. Now, since we've completed this analysis, it was published back in September, utilities have been increasing their peak forecast upward, so it could be even more of this. And during the same time frame, a lot of old power plants are expected to retire, mostly coal. And capacity retirement estimates vary widely. Recent EIA estimates are around 75 gigawatts by 2030, and other sources estimate as high as even 150 gigawatts of asset retirements. Now, the numbers may vary, but the bottom line is that roughly 200 gigawatts of coincident peak demand must be served with new resources added to the grid by 2030. And that new demand, it's a great thing. You know, we're electrifying new parts of our economy like transportation and heating. We're growing the US manufacturing base again, and we're powering generative AI. Now, in the past, we managed these increases in peak demand by increasing the capacity of supply infrastructure, the power plants that generate electricity and the transmission and distribution lines that transport it. We've built natural gas peaker plants that turn on for the maybe 5% or 10% of hours of the year when demand peaks happen. And we've upgraded poles and wires and other equipment like feeders and substations to handle peak demand, but then operate at maybe 15, 20, 30% capacity on average across the year. Now, think about that. our grid is a multi-trillion-dollar system in terms of how much it costs to build and maintain. And in any other context, if you spend $1 trillion on a machine, you'd want to maximize uptime. Now, why should our grid be any exception? Well, virtual power plants, or VPPs, offer an alternative and more efficient approach. As Jeff mentioned, VPPs are aggregations of distributed energy resources, or DERs, like rooftop solar with batteries, EVs and chargers, smart appliances, and flexible commercial and industrial loads that help balance both demand and supply, similar to how a traditional power plant offers supply to meet and balance demand. But VPPs use different distributed energy resources in many different ways. One key way is to shift the timing of demand. So imagine it's a hot summer evening when your neighbors and you get home around maybe 6 p.m., plug in your EV if you have one, crank up your air conditioning, and start running other devices. That creates a big spike in demand. That's the black line shown in this chart that represents a 24-hour load curve. But imagine instead that some of the folks in your neighborhood, maybe you, are enrolled in a virtual power plant. And smart thermostats have pre-cooled some of those homes before 6 p.m. And smart charging systems have scheduled the EV to charge at 10 p.m. or maybe 11 p.m. instead of right when you get home and they're plugged in. That maximum coincident demand is now smoothed. That's the green line in this chart. And with a lower peak, utilities and grid operators don't have to fire up natural gas peaker plants that disproportionately pollute lower income communities. And we don't have to burn and pay for the fuel for those power plants either. Now, while managing down extreme peaks is very valuable to the grid, VPPs can do even more with DERs. Take, for example, a behind-the-meter battery virtual power plant. Now, this example, this diagram, what I'm about to describe, is actually based on a real VPP operated in Hawaii by a virtual power plant company called Swell, in combination with the utility, Hawaiian Electric. Now, Swell and Hawaiian Electric have enrolled about 7,500 batteries to provide grid services. And Swell uses an IT platform to remotely control the batteries to do three things. First, the batteries charge between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., which is really valuable in Hawaii because they're absorbing energy produced from utility scale solar when there may not be enough demand for those electrons to serve. And that means that instead of curtailing the solar, the utility is basically dumping it into the extra capacity of these batteries to be used later, which brings me to the second function. The batteries dispatch energy back to the house between 7 to 9 p.m. when the sun and solar energy supply is going down. It effectively drops the home's demand on the grid to zero. Or if the utility allows it based on the interconnection agreement, the battery may actually export electricity back to the grid and serve the neighbor's house. Then the third function that these batteries perform, the third grid service, is to provide fast frequency response, a sub-second fluctuation in power flow that helps maintain power quality on the grid. Now, you may ask yourself, why would any battery owner opt into this? Well, first off, the battery always maintains enough charge to provide backup power to the house, right? That's the reason why they were purchased in the first place. But that's only about 20% or 50% of the battery capacity that's needed for that. And so that leftover flexible capacity is very valuable to the utility. And in return for the use of that extra capacity, the battery owner gets paid a flat monthly payment of about $15 in this example, based on the battery size, plus an export credit for every kilowatt hour that's provided back to the grid. Now, in addition, the VPP offers sign-up bonuses of around $1,000 per kilowatt for prospective participants considering buying new batteries and enrolling them. And then this way, deploying this VPP has improved the economics of battery ownership for consumers and businesses and thereby accelerated adoption of the DERs, the batteries. Now, in this model and across different types of VPPs, the majority of the cost of deploying the system is just for participant incentives. And so that means that the money spent on VPPs, most of it flows right back to American energy consumers. Now, I've given just a couple examples with this battery VPP and the hypothetical that you saw on a prior page, but I think it illustrates a point that I want to underscore, that the term virtual power plant, it's kind of like the term sandwich. There are many different kinds of sandwiches that contain different ingredients and serve different purposes, right? Just as you could have a high protein club sandwich or a simple peanut butter and jelly, you could have VPPs that export energy like distributed solar and storage, or VPPs that just drop demand at strategic times, like demand response at an industrial site. And just as sandwiches can come on a roll or in a wrap, VPPs can be implemented by a third-party aggregator, selling to a utility or bidding into a wholesale market, or they could be operated in-house by the utility itself. Collectively, all of the different types of virtual power plants can offer a very wide range of benefits. And I'll highlight these benefits and provide a real example to really underscore each. The first is resource adequacy. VPPs can increase the grid's ability to serve higher demand. And by the way, there's no need to wait in 3, 4, 5-year transmission interconnection queues when you're using DERs that are already on the distribution grid. So here's an example. Jigger mentioned it. Portland General Electric has a goal of serving as much as 25% of peak demand with VPPs by 2030. The next benefit is affordability. Adding new capacity with VPPs can be less expensive than with traditional resources. And a Brattle Group study showed that a VPP made up of smart thermostats, smart water heaters, behind-the-meter batteries, and managed EV charging can be 40 to 60% lower net cost to a utility than procuring that new capacity from a peaker plant or even a utility-scale battery. Third benefit, reliability and resilience. By adding a larger and broader portfolio of distributed resources to the grid, VPPs can reduce power outages and or bring back power more quickly in the event of an outage. A great example of this is Green Mountain Power in Vermont. They provide discounted batteries to their customers as a defense against increasingly harsh storms. And they've already saved millions of dollars by using the flexible capacity of those batteries instead of peaker plants when they experience demand spikes. Another good example is in 2022, when California was experiencing an extreme summer heat wave, VPP companies like Sunrun and Tesla delivered peaking capacity to the California ISO to prevent blackouts. VPPs can also play an important role in decarbonization and emissions reduction. And there are a couple different mechanisms at play here. The first is that some VPPs integrate clean energy in the form of distributed solar. The second mechanism is that when VPPs reduce demand, we don't need to turn on as many peaker plants, as I mentioned before. So we're reducing emissions of peakers. And then the third, as we saw in the battery example, is that VPPs can consume or store energy from utility scale power plants, not just solar, but also wind or nuclear when more demand is needed, so that we don't curtail those clean energy assets and they can play a bigger role on our grid. Examples here would include the Swell example we discussed before from Hawaii, as well as the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, or SMUD, and Puget Sound Electric, who uses a VPP as a key part of their decarbonization plan. Moving to the bottom row, transmission and distribution system relief. By shrinking spikes in demand and smoothing fluctuations in power flow, VPPs can reduce strain on T&D infrastructure. A great example of this is in North Carolina, where the North Carolina electric co-ops use over 500 megawatts of DERs to reduce demand charges from the bulk power system operators that they rely on. Community empowerment is another key benefit. Households and businesses with DERs have more control. They have the option to opt into these VPPs to optimize the source, cost, and convenience of their electricity. And more DERs also means more energy jobs in these communities. Couple examples of customer-oriented VPPs would be in Arizona. The APS has grown their Cool Rewards smart thermostat program from 42 megawatts to 138 megawatts in just 3 years by really listening to customer needs. And in Utah, Rocky Mountain Power is looking to double the size of their distributed solar plus storage VPP within 2 or 3 years, which has been a real boon for DER installers in that state who partner with the utility to deploy DERs, and in particular to add batteries to households that already have rooftop solar without a battery. Finally, versatility and flexibility. VPPs are highly configurable to meet the needs of the local grid, and a portfolio of DERs can be adapted over time as those needs evolve. In Massachusetts, National Grid works with VPP company Energy Hub in their Bring Your Own Device program called Connected Solutions. Now, this program was designed for bulk system peak shaving benefits, but it's also evolving to deliver distribution level benefits as well, particularly on constrained circuits. Now, you might ask yourself, if VPPs are such an important solution and have all of these benefits, I know I rattled off a lot, why are we at the Department of Energy so focused on VPPs now? We've had demand response around for decades. You know, we've had utilities hardwiring switches into air conditioners since the 70s. Well, the answer to that question, in part, is we are about to experience a tsunami of distributed energy resource adoption. The amount of capacity added to the grid is growing across 3 categories of DERs. On the left side here, we have DERs that generate electricity. In this case, it includes distributed solar and fuel-based generation. In the middle of the page, you have DERs that consume electricity at flexible times. So smart water heaters, smart thermostats paired with electric heating, and non-residential loads. And on the right-hand side of the page, you have DERs that store energy, in this case, stationary batteries. And with just these examples, we are adding 20 gigawatts of nameplate generation in 2025, increasing to 35 gigawatts in 2030. We're also adding 4 to 6 gigawatts per year of flexible consumption. Now, some back of the envelope math tells you that's roughly 50 peakers worth of flexible supply in the form of flexible demand. And then with stationary behind the meter batteries growing to nearly 25 gigawatt hours in 2030, that's equivalent to hundreds of utility scale batteries. Now, this is capacity that is expected to be paid for every year. And just to underscore this, we're not looking in these charts at the stock of capacity rising each year. This is the flow of additions each year going up. But even these large numbers pale in comparison to the magnitude of capacity coming online with EV adoption. Dozens of gigawatts of demand from chargers and hundreds of gigawatt hours from EV batteries. These numbers, keep in mind, are nameplate. And let's be pragmatic. EVs are only plugged into the grid a fraction of the time. And the capacity available to a VPP will depend on driving and charging patterns, right? Participating in a VPP should not get in the way of you driving your car. But if even a fraction of this capacity is available, that is an enormous amount. But before we look at the growth potential for VPPs, let's take a look at our starting point. VPPs operate across the US today with about 30 to 60 gigawatts of capacity. That number varies based on some definitions and market data. But they're concentrated in a handful of states where electricity market and utility regulations create a favorable environment for VPPs. And these regulatory frameworks vary quite a bit, but I'll give a couple examples. In California, they have multiple auction mechanisms into which VPPs can bid their services and can compete head to head with more traditional resources. In New York, when a utility faces demand increase that could require expensive equipment upgrades, particularly in the distribution system, regulators may require a utility to consider managing down that peak demand with a VPP instead of spending automatically on supply infrastructure. Now, it's no coincidence that the states in dark green, where there's the most VPP activity, are also the states with the highest EV adoption rates, where the need for VPPs is most acute, and the opportunity for flexible demand is also rising. In many other areas across the US, VPPs have been successfully piloted without full deployment, largely because the regulatory framework in which they are implemented is not permanent. But what's different about this moment? Why are VPPs poised for liftoff now? Well, there are a few reasons. So first and foremost, the sheer volume of DER capacity hitting the grid that translates to potential VPP capacity that we just saw. Second, these DERs are more connected than ever, as Jigger and Vanessa were mentioning, right? We can control them with software, with Wi-Fi, with Bluetooth, and their load is highly flexible. And this, as this map shows, a third reason is that we have proven models to learn from. But it's time to move beyond patchwork development and pilots to VPPs at scale. By 2030, VPPs could triple in scale while reducing grid costs and improving grid reliability. At the same time as demand is rising, that's the height of the green bars here, 2023 on the left and 2030 on the right, old power plants are retiring, as I mentioned before. And though the rise in demand and the amount of capacity retiring are a hard number to pin down, the bottom line is that roughly 200 gigawatts of peak demand needs to be served with new resources added to the grid by 2030. By growing VPPs to 80 to 160 gigawatts by 2030, we could address 10 to 20% of peak load. Now, that's not even full potential. That's just with a fraction of the DERs hitting the grid. And that translates to savings for all ratepayers on the order of $10 billion per year from avoided transmission and distribution costs or deferred investments in those systems, as well as avoided fuel costs. But I think what's equally striking about the financial picture here is not just that we are not spending 10 billion per year, but that the money that we are spending on virtual power plants, the majority of it flows right back to the consumers who have chosen to participate. So what will it take to get there? The Liftoff report identifies 5 imperatives for liftoff. 1, expand DER adoption with equitable benefits. 2, simplify VPP enrollment. 3, increase standardization in VPP operations. And this will help integrate VPPs into both utility planning and incentives and wholesale markets. I'll talk briefly about each of these imperatives, and I'll give an example of a priority solution that came about from hundreds of industry stakeholders, which we engaged in writing this report. But do know that there are more detail and more solutions in the Liftoff report itself. So first, expanding DER adoption and ensuring that the benefits of VPPs are enjoyed by all communities. In order to do this, we need DERs to be more affordable. Low-cost financing for low-income or low credit score consumers for VPP-enabled devices like electric water heaters, for example, could shift consumer spending. Now, a lot of these purchases are not discretionary, right? When someone's water heater breaks, they need to replace it fast. A low FICO score consumer, in many cases, has no choice but to put that water heater on their credit card and pay maybe a 30% interest rate. But if we could offer cheap loans that make the smart electric VPP-enabled water heater more accessible, right, with a lower monthly payment, we can shift spending that would have happened anyway, and the consumer would save money on their energy bills without those savings getting eroded away by interest payments on the water heater itself. This is a big focus for us at the Loan Programs Office, where we're trying to make DERs more affordable for everyone. Home electrification rebates from the IRA can also play a big role in making DERs more affordable. And you don't have to own a DER to benefit. Greater DER adoption, as I mentioned before, means more energy jobs and cleaner air for all community members. Simplifying VPP enrollment. We need these DERs as they come online to participate in VPPs. Today, awareness is low and customer acquisition costs can be high for VPP companies and utilities. So to make it as simple as possible for consumers, we need to explore automatic enrollment with opt-out options when someone purchases the DER. Of course, taking into account the appropriate consumer protections. Now, to put a fine point on this, in one study by Uplight, putting the sign up for a smart thermostat VPP on the same page as the online checkout of that thermostat increased enrollment by 400% versus having the sign up on a separate web page, right? We're talking about making it easy for consumers. Next, we need more standardization in VPP operations such that the VPP models that work in one jurisdiction can be scaled up more rapidly across the country. Now, there has been a ton of innovation in VPPs in terms of the types of DERs they aggregate, the grid services they provide, and the increasing frequency with which they are dispatched, right? This isn't just for emergencies anymore. It's part of how we run the grid day to day. But the flip side of that innovation is complexity among VPP providers. One example of this is the data sets and the models that they use to forecast, then operate, and then measure the performance of DER aggregations. These models and methods can vary across VPP providers. Another area would be the data privacy measures, which are not well established across the industry, but are very important. Narrowing down the kind of menu of options of the different ways that these that the aggregations are managed and aligning on best practices can make VPPs more repeatable and accelerate scale up. Now, this kind of alignment, it is happening organically in pockets across the country, but more resources and frankly, tighter coordination is needed. We cannot reinvent the wheel with every VPP, and we don't need to. This type of standardization accelerates the next two imperatives. The next one is integrating VPPs into utilities and planning, utility planning and utility incentives. Now, when it comes to utilities, whether they are regulated by state public utility commissions, municipalities, or otherwise, they don't always have the incentive to choose or even consider a VPP over a traditional resource. Under traditional compensation structures, investor-owned utilities earn about 7, 8, 9% margin on their capital expenditure. In other words, the concrete and steel they're putting in the ground, while operating expenses are paid for at cost. Now, this creates a disincentive for utilities to choose VPPs because VPPs are a low CapEx option. Regulatory frameworks with better aligned incentives, such as performance-based compensation structures, have been deployed in a minority of states across the US, and they could be replicated more widely to spur VPP development. And finally, let's turn to wholesale markets. As of 2020, the 6 regional wholesale markets that are regulated by the Federal Electric Reliability Corporation, or FERC, are required by Order 2222 to allow participation of VPPs. That means it's no longer a matter of whether wholesale markets will allow VPPs to participate, but rather when and how they will. Now, implementation plans vary by market based on region-specific challenges, and some regions have said they need to make multi-year IT system upgrades before integrating VPPs, or that they don't have enough staff to register large volumes of DERs. And so increased resources may be needed to make sure that VPPs are integrated in a timely and inclusive manner. The potential solutions I've highlighted involve a particularly wide range of stakeholders, right? We're looking at the consumer end of the value chain, about needing involvement from community organizations, finance institutions, DER manufacturers and retailers, and more. And then on the grid operations end of the value chain, we need involvement of utilities, national labs building the models, and helping aggregate the data sets. We need regulators and state legislators. And of course, the Department of Energy is playing a role as well. As Jeff mentioned, DOE has already over 20 complementary programs, ranging from low-cost financing for VPP projects, grant funding for grid resilience, technical support for regulators, and more. We are all working to realize a world in which our grid is running more efficiently, we stop polluting neighborhoods with peaker plants unnecessarily, and we make energy more affordable and reliable for everyone. Tripling the scale of VPPs by 2030 will not be easy, but it is very urgent. And we at the Department of Energy look forward to working with all of you to get there. Thank you very much.